Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to recapture the Aggregate plant in the north. In the east has been a new advance in the Peshena direction, north of Makiivka, in the Pokrovsk direction, as well as in the Remevsky Lech direction. There's also some clarification on the Kamyanka direction. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to advance, which was reported on in the earlier video, the direction of Kamyansky, to which a lot of my viewers mentions this drought, which happened following the blowing of the dam, the Novokakhovka dam further downstream, which made a lot of the water go downstream and out into the sea. That is a very good point, because recent satellite footage revealed by some indicate that this is indeed the case. There's not a lot of water remaining here in the direction of Kamyansk. According to, the weather conditions ever since the Novokakhovka dam blew up as well, there's been a heat wave in Ukraine. There's been a long time with little to no rain. This makes it very difficult for the water to then be filled up again. Therefore, the Russian assault here in the direction of Kamyansky could be a result of them being able to cross over from the ground underneath what was previously a river. At the same time, the river going through the area in between the northern and southern parts of Kamyansky would practically be non-existent, and therefore the Russians would in that case be able to cross over that river anywhere within Kamyansky, and that would make a lot more sense in terms of an offensive in the direction of this settlement, capture the fortified positions in the area, to open up and expose the flank of the Ukrainian positions here by Stepove, Lubkove, Pyatkhatki. This will improve the Russian positions in the area and allow them to pincer Stepove, cutting off both Lubkove and Pyatkhatki. Therefore, we may see heavy fighting in the direction of Kamyansky if the Russians commit to an offensive here. In general, we're seeing that the Russians are fighting across a larger section of the front line. Looking at the advances so far in the first week of October, we see that the Russian advances haven't been very large at any one point, and that is because they are advancing at every single part of the front lines. The northern and southern flank of Selidove, Hrynik, Krasnorivka, through Maximilianivka, in the direction of Prokhove, in the area between Marinka and Volodar, north of Volodar, here by Zolota and Nyva, in the direction of Oryhiv and Kamyansk. We also see continuous fighting in the Tveretsk, New York direction, and in the Chasiv direction, where there's little to no advances. But we do see that heavy fighting continues on this entire area, and that is to continue the operations that the Russians have been using. The operational tactics of the Russian army is to widen the front to spread out the Ukrainian forces, especially now that the Ukrainians do not have a lot of manpower and firepower. They cannot cover everything. Therefore, they leave gaps in their defenses when they have to cover everything to defend against the Russian advance. And this leads to advances such as this one, where the Russians have managed to capture Zolota Nyva in a single assault. Footage has been released from both the Ukrainian and Russian side regarding this assault. The Russians released a video of an armored convoy entering Zolota Nyva in the southern direction, hitting the Ukrainian positions and taking control over the settlement. The Ukrainians revealed a video where they hit and destroyed some of the Russian vehicles, one tank, one infantry fighting vehicle, and one armored personnel carrier. They did not show what followed after with a Russian capture of the settlement, and this is the exact point I've been trying to make for a very long time. When one side releases footage of an event and the other side does not, then we do not get a clear picture of what exactly happens. Many times previously we have seen videos coming from the Ukrainian side showing the destruction of Russian armored vehicles, but then we see Russian advances in that exact area, where it is unclear how exactly the Russians did advance when we see in the Ukrainian footage that they were destroyed. That is because the Ukrainians, just as the Russians, pick and choose exactly which parts they want to show and which parts to hide to show themselves as successful. And this advance is the perfect example. According to the Russians, no losses, they simply took the settlement. According to the Ukrainians, 3 losses, and they didn't take the settlement. And therefore we see how this bias doesn't give the clear picture, and I have to navigate through that. Luckily in this case there is footage from both sides, so we got the full picture. With this sudden Russian capture of Zolota Nyva, the Russians will initiate not just the first stage of their operations to capture and connect this southern part by cutting off Korohov, by reaching Constantinople and connecting with the Herenik-Sokurine front further north. The Russians will now be initiating not just the first stage, but also the second stage to capture Bohoyavlenka and Novokrenka, and the third stage towards Shakharsk, Yasna Polyana, and Maximivka. The reason for this is that with the capture of Zolota Nyva, the Russians can now gain control over the road between Novodonetsk and Zolota Nyva, creating a strong flank for the Russian positions on the northern bank of the river line, to then make additional crossings to expand and spread out the front line further, increasing the front line to include Shakhtarsk. This will allow the Russians to attack on a wide front, including the three settlements Bohoyavlenka, Novokrenka, and Shakhtarsk, as well as fighting over Antonivka and Katerinivka. This will allow for a very wide front here north of Vuhledar, and this is exactly what the capture of Vuhledar has opened up for the Russians. This means that the Ukrainians have to defend several settlements over a wide front. If Russians concentrate their forces in any one of these directions, they will be able to break through the Ukrainian lines and go beyond towards the next settlements. The Russians could focus on the western flank towards Shakhtarsk to attempt a larger encirclement maneuver towards Yasna Polyana and Maximivka, to connect towards Konstantinopolsk, along fighting with Antonivka and Katerinivka towards Konstantinopolsk, which will cut off Bohoyavlenka and Novokrenka. Or the Russians could simply focus on attacking every single one of these settlements at the same time, spreading out the Ukrainian forces. What we have seen is that when the Ukrainians have a lot of FPV and UAV drone operators towards the front line, they're able to stop a larger Russian push with upwards of 20 vehicles. However, if they are limited to a few UAV and FPV drone operators, they will not be able to withstand against smaller armored assaults, including just 6 vehicles as an example, as we've seen multiple examples of throughout the battles over Krasnovarivka and generally this southern section of the front line, and additional parts all throughout the front line. When the Ukrainians are lacking in drones, they are simply not able to withstand these armored assaults, which ends up with the Russians capturing a settlement in a single assault. Moving on to the direction of Rodivka, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of the settlement, which is just the forest lines and fortified positions north of it. The Ukrainians still hold 2 fortified positions. One is in the gray zone, the other is fully under Ukrainian hands, and to the west of it there are 3 additional fortified positions. If the Russians capture all 3 of these to the west and the 2 to the north, then they would have an open road between Rodivka and Mirnorod, all the way to this fortified position just outside the settlement, which, as we have seen, is very limited in scale. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of Novovodiane, the Russians have managed to recapture parts of some forest lines and forest patches here to the west of the settlement. The Ukrainians recently launched a offensive operation to recapture some of the positions here west of the Service River line, limiting the Russian foothold across the river line. But now the Russians are moving on the offensive to recapture some of these positions. We've recently found footage of Ukrainian forces fighting here in the direction of Novodiane, where we see heavy shelling on the Ukrainian positions and then running back and forth, avoiding the shelling and Russian drones, as they do some positional fighting in the area. However, the Ukrainians were not met with any success and had to withdraw after some firefights. So we see that the Ukrainians have a lot of armored vehicles available in this section of the front line, considering that they were using them for operations here in the area. This has been reported on by Deep State Map as well, showing that the Ukrainians have some useful forces in the area, well equipped, well trained, and capable of offensive operations. Now that the Russians are launching their own offensive operations, it shows that the Ukrainians are being forced yet again to spread their forces thin and relocate them to other areas to secure the front line, and the Russians are taking advantage of any gaps that appear in Ukrainian defenses. Finally, in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have managed to recapture the Aggregate plant just a few weeks after the Ukrainians managed to recapture it. So we see that the Ukrainians managed to walk in, capture the aggregate plant, make a PR video. Then the Russians heavily bombarded the positions, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from it, leaving it completely open. And the Russians just walked right back in to recapture it, hanging the flag in some of the buildings in the area. So we see that the aggregate plant in the end is nothing but a symbolic position. Whoever captures it and holds it, doesn't really matter whether it's the Russians or Ukrainians. It is complete ruins, and no one is really going to be staying there for much longer either way. And in the end, the significance of this position has been long lost in the ruins of it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.